Hello, am I audible? Since there are just three of you, we can have an introduction. I am Gitika Agarwal. I'm a PhD scholar at CES in IISc Bangalore. I will be your tutor for the day for the fourth week of Wildlife Ecology. Can you please introduce yourselves and why did you choose to take the course or something? You can even type it in the chat box or you can unmute yourself and go ahead. Hello. Would you guys like to introduce yourselves? We can have an interactive class that way. No? Okay. So, okay, let's start with today's tutorial. If anybody has any doubt, you can stop me in between and ask me any doubts you have, and we can discuss them and go over that. Okay. So, this week we learnt about ecological energetics. The Basically these are the energetics that happen in an ecosystem. So we talked about food chains, food webs, the different trophic levels. We talked about productivity and how to measure productivity, and we also discussed nutrient cycles. So, what is a food chain? So, as you can see, the definition here says that a food chain is basically the transfer of energy from one trophic level to the next in the form of food, from producers to herbivores to carnivores and so on. You all must be aware of a food chain. This was taught in high school to every one of us. So there is a producer which takes the energy from the sun, converts it into chemical energy. This is passed on to a primary consumer, which can be an insect or a bird or anything that is directly consuming the producer or the plant. Then there is a secondary consumer that is feeding on these insects. There's a tertiary consumer feeding on the secondary consumer, and so on. Okay, so moving on. So, what are the different trophic levels? So, the different trophic levels, as you can see, a trophic level is basically the the different hierarchical levels in an ecosystem in a food chain. So we start with producers. Producers are basically autotrophs or chemotrophs, the organisms that can produce their own food, that do not need to depend on other organisms for their food and energy requirements. These producers are consumed by primary consumers, which can be omnivores or which are herbivores mostly. Primary consumers are consumed by secondary consumers, which can be anything, omnivores or carnivores, and secondary consumers are consumed by tertiary consumers, so on. And all of these, when they die and they decompose, these dead decaying matter are worked upon or they are eaten by the decomposers, which they act upon these decaying matter and they return the nutrition back to the soil. So let's read what is written here. Organisms belonging to the same, yeah. So organisms that belong to the same trophic level, they perform the same function in the food chain, because all of the organisms belonging to the secondary consumer trophic level will be feeding on herbivores. So they perform the same function and nutritionally they are equally related to the producers. And organisms can occupy more than one trophic levels. Can you give me an example of where organisms occupy more than one trophic levels? Anybody? You can type it out in the chat box. Any example of where an organism is occupying more than one trophic level? Anybody would like to give an example? Secondary consumers, okay. What would be an example of it? Like, can you think of an example where there is an organism that is feeding on different trophic levels? Anything simple will do. Okay, if nobody wants to answer that, a simple example would be if there's a bird. Yes, omnivorous birds. So, a simple example would be if there's a bird, it is feeding directly on the plant, either on the fruits of the plant, then it would be a primary consumer. And if it is feeding on insects that are feeding on that plant, it would be a secondary consumer. Even we as humans, we can act as primary consumers if we are directly feeding on plants and plant produce. And we can act as secondary consumers when we are eating things like chicken or birds that are consuming these grains or these producers. And we can also be the tertiary consumers if we are feeding on birds that are feeding on insects that are feeding on producers. So we can play these different roles in a food chain. Okay, so moving on. So, what are autotrophs or what are producers? So, basically, autotrophs are organisms that can produce their own food. They do not need to depend on other organisms for their food requirements, right? I think everybody is aware of what are autotrophs. And autotrophs can be further classified as either photoautotrophs or chemoautotrophs. Photoautotrophs basically are organisms that use the solar energy or the light energy to manufacture their food, which are like organic molecules, like carbohydrates. And chemoautotrophs, on the other hand, they depend on the chemical energy or the energy from chemical reactions to manufacture their food. And the source of energy, as I said, would be the sun in the case of photoautotrophs, and it would be the chemical reactions in the case of chemoautotrophs. An example, basic example of photoautotrophs will be most of the plants that have chlorophyll, and chemoautotrophs would be these bacteria, these archaea that live in the deep sea hydrothermal vents. So, moving on, we have the other levels, which are the heterotrophs. Heterotrophs, or which are also called consumers, these are organisms, they cannot produce their own food and they depend on other organisms, they depend on producers for their food requirements. Okay, and some these include things like insects, birds, anything that is not a plant and cannot produce its own food. Then there are decomposers, which are also called detritivores. These are organisms that they feed on dead and decaying organic matter, which could be like fecal matter, it could be a carcass, it could be the dead decaying parts of a plant, it could be leaf litter, anything. And then they act on these, they digest them, and then they release the nutrients back into the soil, make it available for the plants to take up again. So they play a very important role in nutrient cycling. Some basic examples of detritivores or decomposers would be earthworms, could be fungi, or could be many microorganisms that are found in the soil. Okay, so what can you tell me what is a biomass and what is a standing crop? We have discussed all the basics that we find in a food chain. So, what is a biomass of a trophic level and what is the standing crop? Can you guys tell me? Anybody knows what is the biomass that is present? Standing crop is the dried biomass. Yes, that is correct. And what is the biomass? You're correct. The standing crop is basically the dried biomass of all the living entities that are present in that particular trophic level. Okay, so biomass basically is the total mass of all the biological entities that are present in a particular trophic level. So you will call that the biomass of that particular trophic level. And standing crop is just the total amount of dried biomass. So the amount of the dried biomass that is present at that particular trophic level. So both of these terms are related to each other. Has the slide changed for you guys? Is the slide showing the types of food chains, or is it still biomass and standing crop? Because for me, it's still biomass and standing crop. Still biomass. Okay. I will share it again. One second. Now, yes. So we have these different types of food chains. So they are classified as grazing food chains, detritus food chains, predator food chains, and parasitic food chains. So can anybody tell me what these different types of food chains mean? What are the different food chains? What is a grazing food chain? How do you define it? And how is it different from a detritus food chain? Can anybody tell me what comes to your mind when you think of a grazing food chain? Anyone? It is pretty simple. It's what the word means. The grazing food chain, the primary producer is grass. Yes. So the grazing, you are entirely correct. It is a plant based, and in the grazing food chain, basically your first step will be the plant, will be the primary producer. So what is the first step in a detritus food chain? We just talked about this. Decomposed matter. Uh, Not really decomposed, but yeah, dead and decaying organic matter. It will be decomposed by the detritivores that act on it. So, which one is longer, a grazing food chain or detritus food chain? Which one can have more trophic levels? Yes, a grazing food chain is longer. Can you tell me why? Why is a grazing food chain longer? Photosynthesis. Okay. Can you be more? Can you elaborate? Yeah, more energy. Yeah. So since I'm looking for a particular term, can anybody say, like, type it out? Then we can move on from there. There is one particular rule because of which a grazing food chain can be longer than a detritus food chain. Yes, it's the 10% energy rule. Exactly. So the 10% energy rule states that the energy that is passed on from one trophic level to the next is just 10%. So of the previous trophic level, right? So since the grazing food chain, it starts with photosynthesis, it starts with plants, there is much more energy present in the beginning of a grazing food chain than there is in a detritus food chain, which is just dead matter. That is why a grazing food chain can be longer in length, can support more number of trophic levels. Now, can you tell me what are predator versus parasitic food chains? This is pretty simple. All of you might be aware of what is a predator food chain versus a parasitic food chain. Carnivores feeding on herbivores. Yes, correct. That is a predator food chain. Very nice. And what would be a parasitic food chain? Yeah, a parasitic food chain basically will be a parasite on a host. So, a predator food chain, in this, the successive trophic levels are made up of carnivores or predators that consume the uh, previous trophic level. But in parasitic food chain, the successive trophic levels are parasites that parasitize the host. Important differences between these food chains are that in the predator food chain, mostly the size of the organism increases as you go towards the higher trophic levels. But in the parasitic food chain, the size of the organisms decrease as you move along the trophic levels. And the number of organisms decrease in a predator food chain. So, like if you have, say, 100 insects feeding on the grass, then you will only have like 10 birds grazing on those or feeding on those insects. And if you move on from that, you will have only 2 to 3 eagles that are feeding on those small 10 birds. But for a parasitic food chain, the number of organisms in the successive levels is going to increase. If there are like 5 birds, there will be around, say, 25 parasites on each. And on those parasites, there can be uh, like 50 more, like two for each, right? For each parasite. So you can have like a bird with fleas, and that fleas can have fiber parasites, which are small parasitic wasps and things like that. So these are the different types of food chains. So in this image, you can see this is what we call a grazing or a predator food chain. It starts with the primary producer, which is grass. It moves on to a primary consumer, which is an insect here. It's a grasshopper. Then there's a frog, snake, hawk, and it eventually ends with a decomposer. So, but here you will see that the number of grasshoppers, the amount of grass that is there, that is more than the amount of grasshoppers that would be feeding on this, and consequently the number of frogs will be lesser than the number of grasshoppers, and so on. Then this is a detritus food chain. There is dead matter, dead decaying matter. There are these leaves. These are fed upon or they are worked upon by the woodlouse, which is eventually eaten up by this blackbird. And then this is an example of a parasitic food chain where you have a producer, that is a plant, which is fed upon by herbivores, which are these fruit eating birds or these or the birds that are eating the leaves and the flowers. Then there are insects, there are parasites on it, there are lice and bugs, and then there are microbes that are parasitic on these bugs. So, moving on, what are food webs? So when you talk about food chains, they're a little bit more idealistic. They're not what happens in the real world. What happens in the real world is that a lot of these food chains, which are independent, sorry, these food chains are not independent, they're always interconnected with one another. All of these food chains are mostly interconnected. They have interconnections between different food chains. And when these multiple food chains, they come together, an intricate structure is formed. And the food chains in the real world are never isolated. As you can see in this image, this is a food chain where you have a plant which is grazed upon by a deer. The deer is consumed by a wolf and eventually decomposes. But what happens in a real life, the plant could be directly eaten by a grasshopper, a bird could be eating the plant, or a ground squirrel could be eating some plant products. Then you have this grasshopper, which again, the insect could be consumed by a bird or it could be consumed by a squirrel. The bird and the squirrel in turn could be consumed by multiple predators. So all of these things are interlinked, and this is a food web. Here is an example of an aquatic food web in which you start by phytoplanktons. Phytoplanktons are basically photosynthetic microorganisms found in the oceans. These are eaten by zooplanktons, which are consumers. Zooplanktons are fed upon by small fish. The small fish is fed upon by a seagull. Seagull is eaten up by the seal. And in the same food, in the food web, the phytoplanktons are directly eaten up by krill. Krill is eaten up by fish or the blue whale. So all of these things are connected with one another. This is a food web which has a lot of food chains connected with each other. So moving on, let's talk about the energy flow in an ecosystem. How does an energy flow in an ecosystem or through a food chain? So you will notice that energy always flows in a unidirectional manner through a food chain. It flows from the producers to the primary consumer to secondary consumer to tertiary consumer, and so on. It will never happen the other way. The energy will never go from the secondary consumer to the primary consumer. It will always go in one direction. And the two laws of thermodynamics, they are also followed in the biological food chains. These two laws are: number one, energy can neither be created nor be destroyed. It can only be converted from one form to another. So in a food chain, you notice that there is solar energy. It is not created or destroyed. Solar energy is converted into the chemical energy between the chemical bonds of carbohydrates, and this is eventually consumed by the different consumers, and it is stored as either biomass energy or the chemical energy in these compounds. And the second law of thermodynamics states that the transformation of energy is never 100% efficient. The energy is never transformed completely from one form to another. There is always some form of loss of energy during the transfer of energy. So, some amount of energy is lost. That is why this is where the 10% rule comes from. From every successive trophic level, you will not get the entire amount of energy from the previous level. There is always going to be a loss of energy, either in the form of heat that is dissipated from our bodies, or we are utilizing that energy to build our own biomass via respiration, or that energy is getting consumed for other processes. So the flow of energy is never 100% efficient. So, as we've discussed for a long time now, can you tell me what is the 10% rule of energy flow? I just told you this. So, can you please tell it to me in your own words? What is the 10% rule of the flow of energy? Anyone? We just discussed this. 10n plus 1 rule. Yeah, that is also one form of the 10% rule. But what exactly is the 10% rule? How do you define it? Only 10% of energy is carried to the higher trophic level. Correct. Exactly. So only 10% of the energy which is stored as biomass in a particular trophic level is passed on to the next trophic level. This is what we call the 10% rule. And the 10% rule limits the number of trophic levels that we can have in a particular ecosystem. So this is how it would look like. If you have 100 joules of light energy coming from the sun, only 10 joules will be available. So if you have 1,000 joules, only 10 will be available because only 1% of it can be assimilated by plants. Rest of it is lost to the environment. Out of these 10, only 1 joule is passed on to the deer, and out of that, only zero point 0.1 joule goes to the lion. So this is the 10% rule. And what you were mentioning, 10 uh, n plus 1 rule, that is also the same. That at the nth trophic level, the amount of energy will be um, energy in the previous trophic level by 10 into n plus 10 n plus 1, like energy at the producer level by 10 n plus 1. So how does energy loss happen? Energy loss happens either, as I mentioned, it is either because of incomplete digestion. We do not completely digest the food that we consume. We always uh, give out some of it as fecal matter, some of it remains undigested. The energy is lost because we're using it for respiration, and the energy is lost as heat, the heat that is dissipated from our bodies to the atmosphere. Moving on. So, ecological pyramids. What are ecological pyramids? Why do we use ecological pyramids? Ecological pyramids basically are the graphical representation of various things, which include the number, the biomass, the energy of organisms at each trophic level in a food chain. So when you're graphically trying to represent what is the number of producers, what is the number of primary consumers, secondary consumers, so on, what is the biomass at each trophic level, what is the energy that the organisms store in each trophic level, that we can do by using an ecological pyramid. And the trophic levels here, they represent the functional role of the species and not a particular species of the ecosystem, because as we just discussed, a particular species can occupy many different trophic levels in a food chain. So here in the ecological pyramid, when talking about trophic levels, it is just the functional role of that species. So what are the different shapes of ecological pyramids that can be, or how can ecological pyramids look like? Can you tell me? There are four different shapes that were discussed during the lectures of ecological pyramids that are out there. Anybody would like to list them out for me? Spindle shaped, yes. Dumbbell shaped, that is also correct. And the two basic ones, inverted pyramid, and yes, and then there will be the basic upright pyramid. So there are four shapes of ecological pyramids that can be. It can be an upright pyramid, it can be an inverted pyramid, it can be spindle shaped or dumbbell shaped. So can you tell me what would be the shape of the ecological pyramid of energy? What would be the shape of the ecological pyramid of energy? Anyone? To give you a hint, the ecological pyramid of energy can only be in one shape. It cannot have any other shape. Yes. It will be a regular pyramid, it will be an upright pyramid because energy keeps on reducing because there's a 10% rule. So the ecological pyramid of energy can only be upright. While the ecological pyramid of numbers and of biomass can assume these various different shapes. So this is what an upright pyramid looks like. So the primary producers will form a base, which will be a broad base, and moving on the trophic levels, the pyramid keeps on becoming narrower. So this can be the pyramid of energy because the amount of energy stored keeps on reducing. It can be a pyramid of number if you're talking about grasses and then insects and then birds and then snakes that feed on those birds. So the normal food chain, or it can be the pyramid of biomass as well for the same food chain. That can also be upright. Inverted pyramid example would be where there is a single, so this is a pyramid of numbers. We have a single producer, which is a tree. Then there are multiple different herbivores that are feeding on that tree. And this is a parasitic food chain, so there are multiple different parasites that can parasitize these herbivorous birds. And there can be many hyperparasites or microorganisms that are parasitizing these parasites. So this is an inverted pyramid of numbers. An aquatic food chain mostly has an inverted pyramid of biomass because the biomass of phytoplanktons is less than the amount of biomass that is stored in the small fish, which is less than the amount of biomass that is stored in the huge whales and sharks. Moving on, the spindle shaped pyramid, it has a narrow bottom and a narrow top. Here, in a similar example where the producer is a single tree, then the herbivorous birds form the middle. They are the primary consumers, and the secondary consumer would be this one single carnivore, the hawk that is feeding on all of these herbivorous birds. Now, a dumbbell shaped example would be there is this pyramid of numbers. There are a lot of grasses which are fed upon by these rabbits, which are lesser in number, but the fleas that can parasitize these rabbits would again be a lot more in number. So, that would form a dumbbell shaped pyramid. So, I hope the different shapes and the ecological pyramids are clear to everybody. So, let's move on to trophic cascades. What exactly is a trophic cascade? A trophic cascade is basically an ecological phenomena which happens if the top or the apex predator is affected. Either you are adding the apex predator or there is a removal of the top predator. Then it is going to lead to a trophic cascade because all of the uh, below trophic levels are going to be affected by the addition or the removal of that top predator. So it involves reciprocal changes in the relative populations of predator and prey. So what do we mean by reciprocal changes? This means that if you increase the predator, the prey is going to go down. And if you increase the prey, the prey, if you increase the predator, the prey is going to go down. And if this prey is predating on something else, then that population is going to go up. So the various trophic levels are going to go up and down. They're going to have reciprocal changes. This leads to dramatic changes in the ecosystem, as was the example of wolves discussed in the Yellowstone National Park. So it led to various changes in the ecosystem and in the nutrient cycling. And Basically, it is also said to be an indirect mutualism between non-adjacent trophic levels or non-adjacent levels of the food chain. So if there's a top predator, that is the wolf, if it is feeding or it is predating on the deer, then the deers will go down, but the alternate trophic level, which is the grass, that is going to go up, and the vegetation is going to thrive in that particular ecosystem. So I hope this is clear. And moving on, we'll talk about a case study of sea otters. So basically, along the Pacific coast of North America, so in 1800s, the sea otters, they are facing extinction. Why? Because they were being hunted for their fur. They were being hunted um, for extracting their fur, and they were facing extinction. So, as you can see in this pyramid, basically there is kelp. There are kelp forests, which are these aquatic plants. They are fed upon by sea urchins, which are the primary consumers, and these sea otters, they feed upon these sea urchins. So, what happened when the sea otter population went really down near extinction? The kelp forests, they were diminished, and there was very little kelp forest left in the on the Pacific coast because the sea urchins were thriving and they were feeding on all of the kelp. But after these sea otters, they were reintroduced and they populated the area again. They brought these sea urchin population under control, and when these got controlled, you can see in this image here, the kelp forests, they were rejuvenated. So there was again a lot more growth of kelp in that area because of control of the sea urchin population. So this is how the top predator is impacting the lower trophic levels. Another example would be of, again, of the sea otters in this coast, but this is a different food chain. Here sea otters are feeding on crabs, which are feeding on sea slugs, which are feeding on algae, which are um, present on these eelgrass. So what happened in the central Californian estuary? Basically, these sea otters, they used to feed on these crabs. So when the sea otter population went down, the number of crabs went up, and they started consuming these sea slugs. So that led to an increase in the amount of microalgae. So here in this image, you can see that the eelgrass or the vegetation is covered with thick algae, and it is not surviving properly. But eventually, when the sea otters here also were reintroduced and they repopulated the entire zone, then they again brought the population of crabs under control, and the sea slugs thrived, they survived, and they ate the microalgae, and the eelgrass here is again healthy and it is free of any algal deposition on top of it. So, this was a case study of the trophic cascades about sea otters in two different situations. The case study discussed in the lecture was about wolves being reintroduced into the Yellowstone National Park and how that controlled the population of deer, and that led to a lot more other populations thriving in that area, bears coming back, vegetation thriving in the area, and the course of river also getting stabilized because of all these um, ecological phenomena. So, moving on, let's talk about ecological efficiency. So, what exactly is ecological efficiency? Ecological efficiency basically is the efficiency with which energy from one trophic level is being transferred to the next trophic level, right? And there are four different subparts of this ecological efficiency. One is the exploitation efficiency, and this is defined as the amount of food that is ingested divided by the amount of prey production. So this is the amount of food that is ingested at the nth trophic level divided by the amount of prey that is being produced at the n minus 1 or the lower trophic level. Then the next one would be the assimilation efficiency, in which that is defined by the amount of food that is being assimilated divided by the amount of food that is being ingested. So how much food you are eating compared to how much food that is being assimilated or used in the production of body mass of that particular trophic level. Moving on to the gross production efficiency, that is how many consumers are produced divided by the amount of food that was being ingested. So, how many consumers or how many organisms in the trophic level are produced divided by how much amount of food is being ingested. And that there is net production efficiency, which is defined by the amount of consumers that are produced divided by the amount of food that is assimilated in this particular trophic level. Not just the food that is ingested, but the food that is being assimilated. And when you come to ecological efficiency, that is the multiplication of the amount of exploitation efficiency multiplied by assimilation efficiency multiplied by the net production efficiency, which just leaves you. So if you multiply these three formulae, 1, 2, and 4, this will leave you with just Pn divided by Pn minus 1. So consumer production divided by the pre-production. How much consumers are being produced divided by how much prey is being produced. That is basically the ecological efficiency. So moving on, so in the second lecture of the week, we discussed about primary production. So as we talked about autotrophs, basically primary production is the synthesis of organic compounds from atmospheric or aqueous carbon dioxide via the processes of either photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. So this is what is primary production. And what is the importance of primary production? Primary production is important because it releases oxygen as the byproduct. It converts solar energy into bioenergy on which all of us depend, because if there is no primary production, there will be no organisms. Nobody can, at least, yeah, there will be no organisms if there is no primary production. And plants form around 99.9% of the Earth's living matter. So that is a big deal, and that is why primary production is important to understand and in general. So in plants, two simultaneous reactions are happening. You all would be aware. One is photosynthesis and the second one is respiration. In photosynthesis, basically atmospheric carbon dioxide is being absorbed, and along with water, this is being acted upon in the presence of chlorophyll and sunlight, and it is converted into glucose, oxygen, and water. So, as we talked, oxygen is the byproduct, and we are forming carbohydrates in photosynthesis. And in respiration, which is the reverse reaction, basically these carbohydrates, they are being oxidized and they are converted into carbon dioxide and water. So here we are sequestering carbon dioxide, or we are sequestering carbon as carbon dioxide is getting fixed into carbohydrates. And here we are releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as carbohydrates are being oxidized. So there are three things that are important in when we talk about primary productivity. There is gross primary productivity, which is basically the amount of energy that is fixed during photosynthesis per unit time per unit area. Then there is net primary productivity, which is basically the gross primary productivity minus the amount of energy that is lost during respiration per unit time per unit area. So you're basically the amount of energy that is being produced during photosynthesis minus the amount of energy that is being lost by respiration per unit area per unit time. And compensation point is very simple. It's basically the point where the rate of photosynthesis is equal to the rate of respiration, or the amount of energy that is being produced during photosynthesis equals the amount of energy that is being lost by respiration in a plant. So these are the three basic terms that are important, or that are important to keep in mind when you're talking about plants and primary productivity. So, what are the factors that affect the net primary productivity and the gross primary productivity? Can you guys tell me? I have explained you all of these different concepts. So, can you tell me what are the factors that affect the net primary productivity and the gross primary productivity? So, like, what do you think these things might be depending on? Or like, since you were light water soil nutrients, right? That is correct. So, but there were two terms that were discussed in the lectures. If anybody knows, like net primary productivity is basically the product of those two terms. If anybody knows that, Otherwise, I will just tell you. So the factors affecting the net primary productivity and the gross primary productivity include APAR and LUE. APAR is basically absorbed photosynthetically active radiation. So in the in the entire spectrum of light that we get from the sun, there is only certain frequencies of it that are actually photosynthetically active, that can be absorbed by the plant and utilized for photosynthesis. So APAR is the absorbed photosynthetically active radiation, and LUA is the efficiency of light use. So light use efficiency. And as you mentioned, sunlight, water, soil, nutrients, these are the factors that affect the APAR. It is affected by the amount of incident light. It is affected by the amount of water that is available, and is affected by the amount of nutrients and minerals in the soil. So, what does the light use efficiency depend on? Can anybody tell me? What is that one factor that affects the light use efficiency? Anyone? So basically, light use efficiency here is impacted by which species of plant we're talking about. So that will be the control of the light use efficiency. Different plant species have different efficiency of utilizing the light. And combining all of this, we come to what does plant productivity depend on. There are seven factors that plant productivity depend on, and we have talked about soil nutrients, we have discussed sunlight, we have discussed water availability. What are the other factors that the plant productivity depends on? Would anybody like to answer that? Can anybody tell me what are the factors that the plant productivity depends on? Concentration of carbon dioxide, leaf arrangement, leaf area. Exactly. So apart from what we already discussed, there is leaf area. How much is the area of the leaf? The greater the area, the greater amount of sunlight it can trap, and more will be the efficiency. The arrangement of leaves, how are the leaves arranged? Are the lower leaves able to get sunlight when they are, or are they always overshaded by the higher leaves? What is the amount of dust and water that is in the atmosphere? How is the cloudiness, and how much is the amount of solar radiation that is reaching the plant? What is the latitude where we are talking about product at which we are talking about productivity? Because tropical zones, or the zones that are near the equator, they receive much more direct sunlight than do the temperate zones on the planet. And solar constant is basically the rate at which the energy from the sun reaches the surface of the earth. So we discussed the incident sunlight, which would be covered in the solar constant, the rate at which energy from the sun is reaching the surface. There is latitude, that is the location where you want to talk about productivity. Cloudiness, again, is impacting the amount of sunlight that is coming. Dust and water in the atmosphere, the amount of water availability, then the concentration of carbon dioxide, and the leaf and leaf arrangement would depend on the species of the plant. So these are the different factors that are affecting the plant productivity. Now, let's talk about the different types of lake on the basis of their productivity. So even the lakes can be categorized in different types depending on what is the level of productivity in that lake. There is an oligotrophic lake, mesotrophic lake, eutrophic, and hypereutrophic. So can you guys tell me how are these different from each other, and what are these? Like, what is an oligotrophic lake? What is a mesotrophic lake? And how are these different from one another? Yeah, they're different on the basis of productivity. So, which one is the least productive? Yes, so these are some, yes, Rajeshri, these are some of the factors of an oligotrophic lake. It is low in nutrients, it has algae, clear water. So these are some factors of these different lakes and how they are different from each other. So if you look at an oligotrophic lake, as you mentioned, there will be low productivity, there will be low algae, the water will be clear, turbidity will be low, and the Secchi depth would be high. So can anybody tell me what is the Secchi depth, or how do you define it? Then we'll move on to discussing the other lakes. Anybody? What is Secchi depth? No one? Okay, so basically, it is the, yeah, visible from the surface. It is basically the measurement of how turbid is the water. So we have this disc that has four sections, two of them black, two white. So if you are holding it in air, you can clearly tell where are the black parts and where are the white parts. But as you, so there's a rod connected to this disc and you dip it in the water. So as it goes deeper and deeper inside water, eventually you will not be able to tell apart where are the black zones and where are the white zones on the disc. So if the water is very clear, like in a oligotrophic lake, you'll be able to tell apart these differently colored zones even till a greater depth. So higher the Secchi depth, lower the turbidity of the water. And as you move on from an oligotrophic to a hypereutrophic lake, the turbidity keeps on increasing and the Secchi depth keeps on decreasing. And these eutrophic and hypereutrophic lakes, these are basically lakes with high productivity. They have high amount of nutrients, which leads to a high algal growth and more turbidity of these water. A hypereutrophic lake basically will have a very low oxygen and will not be able to sustain any other life apart from those algal blooms on its surface. So moving on, so the various sources of nutrients, how are these nutrients reaching the lake? So the various sources here would be rivers depositing the sediments. So the rivers that are flowing into these lakes, they're bringing sediments along with them and they're depositing them into the lake, and eventually the sediments are breaking down and nutrients are getting released. There are bird droppings, the birds that feed on the fishes, or even other birds when they fly over the lake. If they give out fecal matter, there are bird droppings, then they will get dissolved in the water. And there are, since they are rich in uric acid, they are rich in nutrients. So that will lead to deposition of nutrients in the lake. Upwelling of oceans. Upwelling basically means, so in an ocean, the deeper layers, they are more nutrient rich, but they do not support life. Why? Because sunlight does not reach these deeper layers. So there is no primary productivity in those deeper layers of water. But if there is upwelling and these deeper water layers were to come on the top because of this upwelling of oceans, then in the top now you have high amount of nutrition and high nutrients, and you also have sunlight. So that is going to lead to an increased amount of productivity on the top levels of the ocean. And dust clouds, basically when there is wind or when there is deposition of dust in these areas, that also has a lot of nutrition in it for a lot of different types of minerals, and that leads to addition of nutrients to that lake. Coming to the last lecture, we discussed about in the last lecture nutrient and biogeochemical cycling. So can anybody tell me what do we mean by nutrient cycling, or what are nutrient cycles, and why exactly do we call them biogeochemical cycles? Anybody, would you like to define a nutrient cycle or the basic definition of a nutrient cycle? Okay. Yeah, that is correct, Samarth. So basically, nutrient cycling or biogeochemical cycling is the pathway in which a chemical substance moves through the biotic and the abiotic components of the environment. So the nutrients are getting cycled through the biotic and the abiotic components of the environment. One second. I think the slideshow is not working. Yeah. So it is how these various nutrients are getting cycled through the environment or the ecosystem. But why do we call them? Why do we also call them biogeochemical cycles? Why do we use this term? Movement and transformation of chemical elements, components between living organisms, atmosphere, and the earth crust. Yes, very nice, Abarish. And since you mentioned earth crust, so we call it biogeochemical cycles because there is the bio element of living organisms, there is the geo element of the earth crust and the various rocks and soil, and there is the chemical element because these are the chemical compounds. The nutrients are chemical compounds which are being cycled in the environment. So let's discuss the different types of nutrients that are out there. So, nutrients are classified as either micronutrients or macronutrients, depending on the quantity in which they are required by the organisms. If we need huge amounts of the nutrients, we call them macronutrients. If we need them in small quantities, they are micronutrients. Some macronutrients include nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur. And some micronutrients are these elements of like these metal, boron, copper, iron, chlorine, zinc, molybdenum. These are some micronutrients that organisms require. And nutrients are classified as essential or non essential based on if organisms can survive and complete their life cycles without that nutrient or not. If they cannot complete their life cycle in the absence of that particular nutrient, it is a very essential nutrient and it could be directly involved in the metabolism. And the deficiency of that particular nutrient cannot be met by supplying some other nutrient. It cannot be substituted by any other nutrient. You need that particular nutrient itself for performing that particular task. So these are the various classifications of nutrients in that are used or that are consumed by organisms. And some examples of the essential nutrients in plants are nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. So, can you tell me one by one what is the use or what is the purpose of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur? So, why do plants or why do we need nitrogen? What does it do or what does it make? Why is it an essential nutrient? Anyone? Can you tell me why do we need nitrogen? Okay, yes, it's a constituent of amino acids and it also forms proteins. Correct. So basically, nitrogen is found in proteins. It forms nucleic acids, various vitamins, and hormones. So it is a very essential nutrient, and without it, we cannot survive. We cannot complete our life cycles. And the nitrogen that is found in amino acids in these proteins, it cannot be replaced by any other element out there. So it is an essential nutrient. Why is phosphorus an essential nutrient, or what does phosphorus do? Yes, it is a constituent of the nucleic acids. So okay, Samarth, you are correct. Phosphorus is a constituent of nucleic acids. It is a constituent of ATP, which is the energy currency of the cell. ATP is adenosine triphosphate, and this is how we store energy in our body. And ATP is broken down to ATP, and that is how we utilize the energy in our body. Phosphorus is an important constituent of the cell membrane. Cell membrane is basically the membrane that binds the cell and keeps all the organelles inside it. And phosphorus is also an important part of the proteins. So how is potassium essential? What does potassium do in our bodies or in plants? Where is it used? To maintain normal fluid levels, yes, we need it for the osmotic potential and maintaining the turgidity of the cell. In animals, for movement of muscles, yes. So okay, potassium here is required to maintain the cation and ion balance in a cell, and by that it will maintain the osmotic potential inside the cell, which will lead to water movement into the cell and make the cell turgid. And when the cells next to the stomata become turgid, the stomata start opens, and if they lose their turgidity, if the water moves out, the stomata close. So it controls the opening and closing of stomata, and it also is important for activation of a number of enzymes in the plant. So now, moving on to calcium. How is calcium used, or how is calcium essential in plants? Anyone? Yeah, for bones, that is for animals. How is calcium? That is entirely correct, Rajeshri. We need calcium for our bones, but how is it essential for plants? What does it do in plants? Yes, it forms calcium pectate, which is an important part of the cell wall, and this is required when a cell is dividing. So in plants, when cells divide, they don't really divide into, like, this is a cell, they don't really divide like this into two cells, but what really happens is a cell wall builds in between the two daughter cells, and for the building of that cell wall you need calcium pectate, and for that you need calcium. So calcium is a constituent of the cell wall, and it is plays a very important role in cell division in plants. It plays an important role in the calcium channels. These are the channels that are present in the cell membrane, in the cell wall, in the cell membrane, that open and let the calcium inside the cell, and again for for the activation of certain enzymes. Where does magnesium come in handy for a plant? What does it do? Yes. So magnesium is an important component of chlorophyll, and it's which is important to absorb sunlight and use for photosynthesis. Correct. So it is an important constituent in the chlorophyll, and if magnesium is not there, you cannot form chlorophyll, and primary production would not happen, and also leads to activation of certain respiration enzymes. Now moving on to sulfur. So how is sulfur important for a plant? So sulfur is the constituent of these two amino acids, cysteine and methionine, without which many proteins will not form, because methionine is mostly part of the start codon. So the proteins will not form without these amino acids. They are essential amino acids. And there are vitamins that contain sulfur, and there are various coenzymes that also contain sulfur. So these were some of the uses or of these essential nutrients. We talked about these six essential nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur. And you will notice that most of their functions are to do with proteins, they're to do with nucleic acids, that is our genetic material, and for plants, they're to do with the cell wall formation, for maintaining the cell turgidity, or for chlorophyll. So these are the processes that are very important for our life, and the organism or the plant cannot maintain without or in the absence of any of these essential nutrients. So moving on to the various cycles, we'll discuss the various cycles one by one now. So first comes the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen is found in the atmosphere, and it is also found in the soil in the form of nitrates and nitrites. So from the atmosphere, nitrogen the is found in the form of so this nitrogen cannot be directly used by plants, as we know. It needs to be fixated. So nitrogen fixation happens here is rhizobium in the plant roots. As we discussed earlier, this mutualism between rhizobium and leguminous plants. So this rhizobium is a nitrogen fixing bacteria. It fixes nitrogen to ammonia. And ammonia, by the process of nitrification, gets converted into nitrites and nitrates. So ammonia to nitrites. Can you tell me which bacteria converts ammonia into nitrites? Anybody? There are two of these bacteria that convert ammonia into nitrites. So basically, for this step of nitrification, yes, correct, Samarth, we need nitrosomonas, or there is this second one called nitrococcus. These two convert ammonia into nitrites. And then the nitrifying bacteria here is nitrobacter, which converts nitrite into nitrate. And this nitrate then can be utilized by the plant and can be absorbed by the plant and used for creating the biomass. And this nitrogen from plant gets incorporated into the food chain, and from the food chain it goes either into the dead matter or into the fecal matter. It's acted upon by decomposers, and via ammonification it is converted back into the ammonium ion. And this can either be returned back to the atmosphere in the form of ammonia, released in the form of ammonia, or it can again get incorporated into the soil nitrogen by nitrifying bacteria. Another way in which nitrogen gets directly taken up from the atmosphere is by lightning. During lightning, there is high amount of electrical discharge, there is high heat, and nitrogen directly reacts with oxygen to form nitrites and nitrates. And the third way is by industrial fixation. So in industry, humans, they carry out different chemical reactions by which we fix atmospheric nitrogen into nitrates, which we later supply to the soil as fertilizers. We add to the soil for a plant growth. So this is the basic nitrogen cycle, in which the atmospheric nitrogen is getting cycled with the soil nitrogen. By three basic processes: there is lightning, there is biological fixation of nitrogen, and there is industrial fixation. And then the nitrogen from the soil gets released back into the atmosphere. How? Through the food chain. It gets taken up by the plants, gets incorporated into the food chain, and is released by the decomposers. So the processes that happened in the nitrogen cycle, the various important processes include: number one, the nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation, as I said, it's the conversion of atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia. How is atmospheric nitrogen getting converted into ammonia? And we discussed there are three methods: there is biological reaction, there is lightning, and there is the industrial fixation. Biological reaction can happen by these rhizobium that are present in leguminous plant roots. There is azotobacter. Azotobacter is a free living bacteria in the soil. Rhizobium is present in a mutualistic relationship with leguminous plants. Nostoc and Anabaena are cyanobacteria. These are also present in the soil. They convert nitrogen into ammonia. This process is called nitrogen fixation. Lightning also, in high temperatures, nitrogen reacts with oxygen, gets converted into nitrites and nitrates. And industrial fixation happens by two processes: Haber's process, in which nitrogen reacts with hydrogen to form ammonia, and Ostwald process, in which ammonia is then oxidized further to nitrites and nitrates. So the first important process of a nitrogen cycle is nitrogen fixation. The second is ammonification, where ammonia is produced by the decomposition of organic nitrogen that is present in dead matter. We discussed it. So ammonification will release back the soil nitrogen, or the nitrogen that got fixed into the food chain, back into the atmosphere. And nitrification is the oxidation of ammonia to nitrites and nitrates. So we also discussed this happens by nitrococcus and nitrosomonas, where it gets converted into nitrite, and further by nitrobacter converts into nitrates, which are taken up by the plants. Moving on to the water cycle. So water cycle you all would be familiar with. It is taught since like 7th grade to all of us. Water cycle is pretty simple. So you have all this surface water in the form of oceans or in the form of lakes, rivers, from where water gets evaporated. And also this water is taken up by plants from where it gets transpirated. From transpiration, the water gets converted into water vapor and it reaches the atmosphere. It is present there as water vapor. And from the hilltops, the ice directly gets converted into water vapor by sublimation. The solid gets converted into vapor. In the atmosphere, it goes to the higher atmospheric layers, it cools down, and it forms these clouds by condensation. When these clouds they come together, they form bigger clouds which become heavier. Then they fall down as precipitation, and this water is gets returned to the oceans, to the rivers, to the lakes, and it also gets percolated, infiltrated, forms groundwater from where it is taken up by the plants. So this is the water cycle, and this is how water gets cycled through the ecosystem. Via the various processes include evaporation, transpiration, sublimation, condensation, precipitation, infiltration, percolation. So these are the different methods. And in precipitation, it can come down as rainwater or it can come down directly as snow on the hilltops. Okay, moving on, we have the carbon cycle. Again, very simple. Carbon cycle involves carbon that is present in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide is sequestered by terrestrial plants via photosynthesis and also by phytoplanktons via photosynthesis and present in the ocean. These phytoplanktons they are fed upon by zooplanktons and other organisms that eventually and they get fixated as limestone in the shells of these marine organisms as calcium carbonates. Coming to the terrestrial food chains, the carbon dioxide is taken up by plants via photosynthesis. It forms the various carbohydrates, and these plants are eaten by the various animals, and this carbon gets sequestered in the food chain. And when we respire, and when the plants respire, it is returned back to the atmosphere. When these animals and plants they die, they decompose, then by decomposition various fungi and other detritivores they release back the carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Or these living matter they can fossilize, they can form fossils which are eventually taken out by humans used as fossil fuels, and by the combustion of fossil fuels you also again release carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide is either present in the atmosphere, or carbon is either present in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, or it is present in all of us as carbohydrates and as an important part of our biomass. So this was the carbon cycle. Moving on, we have the phosphorus cycle, which again is very simple. So you start phosphorus is mostly present in rocks, and when these rocks they get weathered and they reach the oceans, the phosphorus gets deposited into the oceans. In oceans, the phosphorus is taken up by algae. The algae are fed upon by seabirds, and the seabirds, when they release fecal matter, which is called guano, the fecal matter of seabirds is called guano. It is very rich in phosphorus, and when um, these bird droppings, they get incorporated into the soil, and they form the phosphorus resource in the soil. Rocks, instead of getting weathering into the ocean, they can also get directly weathered into the soil, and they can also form the phosphorus deposits in the soil. This phosphorus is taken up by plants, or humans can intervene and they can mine these rocks for fertilizers, and they can directly add this into the soil, and this is taken up by plants. From the soil, the phosphorus is acted upon by mycorrhizae, which are better at absorption of these nutrients, and the plants take them up. It gets incorporated into the food chain, and then again, when the plants they form the dead litter, leaf litter, or when these animals they die, they form the waste matter. Then these detritivores like saprobionts they release the phosphorus back into the soil. So this is how the phosphorus gets cycled between rocks, oceans, soils, and the food chain. Coming to the last cycle, which is the sulfur cycle. Sulfur cycle basically involves the release of sulfur into the atmosphere by volcanic activity, or the release of sulfur into the atmosphere from industries, where if we extract metals, there is a lot of sulfur in that. If you're burning coal, a lot of sulfur dioxide is or hydrogen sulfide is released into the atmosphere. So this sulfur in the atmosphere, this reacts with the water vapor, and when it precipitates, it comes down as acid rain, which contains sulfuric acid. This can get incorporated into the soil, it can reduce its fertility, or it can get into the water bodies and flow and form the sulfide sediments, which are again taken out by the humans for their industries. If they get incorporated into the soil, they are acted upon, they're either added into the fertilizer, they're present as sulfate in the soil, and they're taken up by the plants, and they again get incorporated into the food chain. And as we discussed, the plant waste, the animal waste, the dead matter is acted upon by detritivores, and it again gets released into the atmosphere, or it gets added to the soil as nutrients. So this was the last cycle, which was the sulfur cycle. And we would end by discussing how the humans have impacted the various nutrient cycles. So humans have a huge impact on all of these cycles and on the ecosystem in general. And one way that happens is, as we all know, by deforestation. By deforestation, how we disrupt the nutrient cycle, we cut down the trees, and you would expect so these trees they bind the soil together, and the water cycle, when precipitation happens, these trees they take up a lot of water, and also a lot of this water gets stored into the or gets incorporated into the groundwater resource, and a lot of it also gets into the leaf litter, and which later evaporates and forms water vapor again and also gets transpired through plants. But if you deforest the entire area, then what is noticed by scientists is that these streams, the water flow in the stream reduces, which is sort of counterintuitive, because if there is precipitation and there are no trees to hold back the water, the stream should be overflowing with water. Why is the amount of water low in the streams? But what they noticed is, when the area got deforested, then new plants started coming up, and these are younger plants. They take up a lot of water, and not much of it can percolate to the streams. That is why the streams they started drying up. The amount of water halved in these streams after some time of deforestation. When the forest becomes adult, when the trees are like 15 years of age or so, they take up less amount of water, because a lot of their cellulose and these different biomass is already built, so they don't need water for that purposes, for those reactions. So they don't take up a lot of water, and whatever they take up is also gets transpired. But by young plants, a lot of water gets into the plant, it gets into the various chemical reactions, gets stored, does not reach the streams nearby. So this is how deforestation it impacts the water flow in the stream. And as we said, there is soil erosion, because the water holding capacity of the soil, or the binding capacity of the soil decreases, because there are no tree roots holding the soil together. Then what happens when we're adding all these fertilizers for green revolution, or for increasing the agriculture, for meeting the increasing human demands? When we are adding all these fertilizers, they increase the amount of nutrients that are present in the soil. And when there is rainfall, when these there is surface runoff, these nutrients they get leached into the nearby water bodies, into the nearby lakes. And as we discussed, this leads to eutrophication of lakes, and eventually that leads to the death of the lake, because if there is a high amount of nutrient in the lake, there will be high algal bloom, and no fishes and nothing else can survive in that lake. So it is going to harmfully impact the lakes in that area. And as we discussed in the previous cycle, which is the sulfur cycle, if we keep on, extracting sulfur and we keep on releasing it into the atmosphere via various industries, it is going to lead to a lot of sulfur rain. And this acid rain is eventually going to impact the growth of plants. The plants will not be able to grow in soil which is very heavy in sulfur, because it also needs other nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus. All of these are absent if the soil is becomes very acidic and holds a lot of sulfur. So this was my last slide, but I am here. You can ask me any doubts. If you have any doubts in my slideshow, or if you had any doubt from the lecture, or if you want to discuss any of the previous assignments, you can ask me these doubts. And people who have no doubts, they can leave the meeting. People who have doubts, you can ask me. We can discuss the doubts, and we can also discuss the previous assignments if you'd like. I think till week 3, all the assignments have been like the solutions have been shared with all of you. If you have any doubts in these assignments, we can discuss them. Thank you. Thank you for attending the lecture and for this recap of the week. Okay.